This is part 5 of the Ontario Hazelnut IPM workshop series for 2021 Early Spring Insects. My name is Melanie Filitas and I am a horticulture integrated pest management specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Throughout this series, we will be discussing a number of pest problems common to Ontario hazelnuts. For general information on hazelnut scouting and an overview of this series, please refer to part 1 of this presentation series, Introduction to Hazelnut IPM. First, I just want to start by distinguishing between the two main types of insect pests in horticultural crops. The first one would be a direct pest, which refers to an insect that damages the portion of the crop that is harvested and sold. In this case, that would be the hazelnut itself. In general, we have less tolerance for these pests because they have such a direct impact on yield, so we generally need to implement management practices at earlier pest densities. An indirect insect pest damages non-harvested portions of the tree, such as the leaves or the trunk. In the case of hazelnuts, that's typically the leaves. Because it removes photosynthetic material from the tree, that it will definitely have a negative impact on tree health and sometimes in turn on crop quality and yield, but the trees can support some level of damage without having a significant impact on yield, so we sometimes can wait till we have higher pest densities to implement a control. This table was created to provide you with a general overview of the main direct and indirect insect pests found in Ontario hazelnut orchards, grouped by the level of impact they've had on the crop so far. The only direct insect pest that has really been of concern has been bud mites, but there have been a number of indirect insect pests that have been problematic, particularly in younger orchards. Japanese beetle and gypsy moth have caused significant defoliation across a number of Ontario orchards. Aphids and scale, which are both sucking insects, have been problematic as well, but only in certain orchards. We will be covering all of the insects in this table over the next 3 presentations. This figure shows you when you can roughly expect to see these insect pests in hazelnuts throughout the year. This is obviously going to vary quite a bit with environmental conditions, so it's more of a guideline. However, it's hopefully going to help you determine what order you should be looking for things at different points in the season. The green bars highlight when the pests are most likely to be active in the orchard, but the blue bars are indicating times when it's less common but may still be present. In this particular presentation, we're going to be discussing insects common in hazelnuts in early spring, so from about bud break through mid to late May. So that specifically is bud mites, scale, and spring feeding caterpillars. Bud mites are the most important of the insect pests of hazelnuts, but I have that in quotations because they aren't actually insects. They are microscopic members of the spider family, and they're related to some of the foliar pests you may be familiar with from other crops, such as two-spotted spider mite. However, they have a slightly different biology. This pest has been increasing in Ontario hazelnuts over the last 10 years. And when we talk about bud mites, we're actually referring to 2 species. The main one of concern is the big bud mite, or Phytopthis avellanae, which causes the main damage that we see on hazelnuts. However, there is another species, Cystophyopsis vermiformis, which does not have a common name, that has been reported in blasted buds in most hazelnut growing regions. It's less of a primary pest and more likely to invade buds that are already invaded by the big bud mite, but it can make damage worse. We have not confirmed this in Ontario, but we expect that it is present here. As you may have guessed from their name, bud mites spend the majority of their life cycles within the hazelnut bud, and their feeding tends to cause blasting or big buds. So these are essentially swollen, fleshy, or deformed buds that are often pinkish or brownish. And you can see that in this upper left figure. Depending on what type of bud is infested by the mite, there's different damage. So an infested vegetative bud will have weak, unhealthy shoots. If a catkin is infected, they can become brittle and produce little pollen. And if a fertilized flower becomes infested with mites, then that may lead to no nut production at all. Most of the life cycle is spent inside the bud, so controls, or whether they be chemical or biological, applied will have very limited effect against them because they're protected within that bud. This makes them quite difficult to manage. However, there is a brief exposed period in the spring when the mites are moving from infested buds through to new buds, and that is the main time where controls need to be targeted. This is a life cycle diagram which illustrates what we think is the life cycle of these 2 mite species in Ontario. Starting on the left, blasted buds containing the overwintering mites are present beginning in about February and extending through to April. At that time, the enlarged buds become really evident, and that's the time they're most easily spotted in the orchard. Now, from May to June, healthy buds present on the trees will start to form shoots, as you can see here. And those shoots will have these very, very tiny auxiliary buds present, which I've outlined with this circle down here. When that happens, and when temperatures become warm enough, the bud mites will leave the blasted buds, as evidenced up here, and will move to the auxiliary buds and just kind of hang out at the base of those buds or nearby and wait for them to develop. As those auxiliary buds enlarge, the mites will then invade those buds, and from May to September, the immature stages of the big bud mite will do some feeding within those auxiliary buds, but the buds will not enlarge until the adults are present later in the year. So around June, the old blasted buds that were present on the tree will dry up and they'll fall off. And so what you are left with is basically a bunch of buds with young mites inside that are not enlarged. So it can be difficult to tell at that time if they are infested with bud mite. Now in Oregon and other areas, they can have some additional bud enlargement from June to August, and that's caused by the second species. So that's this green mite here, the C. vermiformis, the one that we're not entirely sure if it is present in Ontario. So I've indicated its portion of the life cycle with a dashed line down here at the base of this life cycle here. So at that time, what you're going to have is potentially the appearance of adults of this second species, and then the populations of that species will increase, and you can get some additional bud enlargement due to that species. Again, we don't know if that's present in Ontario. However, if you do see enlarged buds appearing in mid to late summer, that's likely due to this second species. Those adults will then leave those buds and move to newly blasted buds around August through September, so about here. But so there is another exposed period again, but that's only due to this second species. So the main exposed period when the buds are out and available for control is in May through June, when that pink species, the P. avalene, is moving, because that's the one that causes the most damage. Moving into September, the adult form of the big bud mite will begin to appear, and then the numbers of those mites will begin to increase. At this time, the buds will start to enlarge and get a little bit bigger, becoming fully blasted by February, and then the cycle begins again. This is a close-up of an infested bud. When the bud is very heavily damaged by bud mite, it will go completely brown and kind of mushy, which is a good indication that you have bud mites present. This photo was taken with a hand lens, and what you can see is the mites look like kind of tiny little cigar-shaped white grains of rice. So I've circled some in the middle of this figure, but initially it can be quite difficult to know for sure what you're looking at. If you watch them long enough, they will often start to move. It's also difficult to make out the features of the mites. They don't have much in the way of legs, but they do have some antennae and head parts that are present, especially at the adult stage, that you can see, but only with higher magnification. So this photo here was taken with a microscope, and so you can see the mites in a little bit more detail, but what you can see is that they are only about 0.2 millimeters long, and you really need some high-level magnification to look at them close up. If you do look at them close up, though, you can see that they have these little mouth parts and antennae at the very tip of the body, and they also will wiggle about a bit if you look at them for long enough, and that's how you can confirm that they are in fact mites. To monitor for bud mites, if you're interested in assessing level of infestation in your orchard, then the best time to do that is in late winter or early spring, when those blasted buds become obvious and there's no leaves on the tree. Sometimes in Ontario, that can happen a little bit later in the spring, but just generally that starts in February and persists through about April. That will tell you the level of infestation that might be present in your orchard. But if you're looking to time controls, then what you want to find is that critical period of mite movement when they leave the blasted buds and move into the newly formed buds. And that happens between April and June. And one way to check that is to take double-sided sticky tape, which is just basically a double-sided Scotch tape that you can buy at Walmart or Staples or any store that sells tape really, and wrap that tightly around hazelnut branches or twigs at the base of where there is a bud. So this, I'm trying to circle this here so you can see some tape. It doesn't really need to be sticking out that much. I've just done that so it's a little bit more evident in the photo. But basically you wrap that around the twig, and then periodically you can check that tape with a hand lens, and you want to be checking it at least weekly, but during peak migration periods in May and June, depending on temperature, you might want to look at it even more frequently. And you're going to want to look with a very high magnification hand lens. And in fact, when we monitor for them in our research orchard, we tend to like to use a microscope. And as the mites appear, that will tell you they're moving. According to research from Oregon, movement tends to occur when daily maximum temperatures are above 15 degrees Celsius, or you're having average temperatures of 9 degrees Celsius, particularly under long-term warming trends, so as temperatures are warming up. So this is being filmed or being recorded in May, and it's been quite cool. So we're seeing reduced mite movement, but it's now starting to warm. And in the Simcoe orchard, we're starting to see mites start to pick up on that tape. Research from Oregon has indicated that the most effective treatments occur when about 50% of mites have migrated out of the blasted buds. Just going to touch on some general management of the mites. First is varieties. Research has shown that varieties with small, tight buds tend to resist penetration by the mites. And the majority of varieties that have originated out of Oregon through their breeding programs have been bred to be resistant to bud mites. So as a rule, if you're growing Oregon varieties, you won't have a lot of bud mite problems. However, what we found is that some of the varieties selected from Ontario and the Northeast for their tolerance to eastern filbert blight do tend to be quite susceptible to bud mites. So for some growers, this may have to be something you have to balance. If you're looking for fresh market EFB tolerant varieties, you may have to deal with a bit more bud mites. This slide just lists the varieties that are reported from other areas with moderate to high resistance to bud mite. You'll notice, though, that some of those varieties, such as Barcelona or Hall's Giant, are quite susceptible to eastern filbert blight. So that would have to be taken into account. Jefferson and Yam Hill are popular varieties here that come from Oregon. They do tend to be resistant to bud mite, but they can be susceptible to eastern filbert blight under Ontario conditions. On the right, we've also listed some varieties from the Simcoe Research Station where we don't see a whole lot of bud mite, and those include Chelsea, Delta, G17, and Theta. Those may have a little bit less filbert blight and bud mite, so they might be good to grow, or at least for fresh market. Tonda also has not had a lot of bud mite infestation on the Simcoe station, but it is extremely susceptible to eastern filbert blight. Going back to cultural controls, in addition to variety selection, if you have small enough trees and few enough trees in your orchard, you can physically remove the blasted buds and either take them out of the orchard altogether or just toss them in the middle of the orchard in case there are predators present in the buds. So that would preserve those populations within the orchard. That can be helpful in getting bud mites out, but obviously if your trees are very large or you have a large acreage in your orchard, that may not be practical for your time. In terms of biological control, we do find predatory mites in the buds every year, so they are having some activity on the bud mite populations, and other predators often wait outside the buds as the mites emerge in the spring to prey on them. So anything you can do to preserve predatory mite populations in terms of selecting insecticides for other pests that are soft on predatory mites will preserve those and help keep populations under control. However, to date, we have found that on very bud mite susceptible varieties, the biological control agents can't really fully keep those mites under control. For chemical controls, at present, there are no products specifically registered against filbert mite in Canada. However, we do have a number of miticides that are registered for other foliar mites in Ontario, which may have some efficacy against bud mite when you are applying them for foliar mites. However, it's important to remember that those sprays are not effective when the mites are inside the buds. So if the foliar mite sprays aren't going on during the period of migration of the bud mites, then they probably will have only limited effect on bud mites. We are hoping to get more products registered on bud mites, specifically in hazelnuts, in the future. After bud mites, spring feeding caterpillars are often the insects one sees first in a hazelnut orchard. They can actually be active very early in the season, depending upon the temperature. Spring feeding caterpillars refers to a complex of several species of caterpillars, and I've put up here a few examples that you might find in a hazelnut orchard. So these include tent caterpillars, which are known for their distinctive tents or mats that they form on the trees. The green fruitworm is another species you might see, and then the oblique banded leaf roller, or we often refer to that as OBLR. OBLR actually has two generations. The first one feeds on the foliage in early spring, and we lump that in with spring feeding caterpillars. However, in Oregon, the second generation can feed on the nuts, so we'll be covering that again in the late season pest presentation. Gypsy moth has been the most problematic of spring feeding caterpillars, and I will be including a few additional slides on that after I touch on the complex as a whole. However, it's not limited to just these species. There are other caterpillars you may encounter from time to time. For the vast majority of these caterpillars, the larval stage is limited to the early spring, and by the end of the spring, they pupate, become adults, and they do not feed. So since they're mainly active before the nuts form, they tend to be an indirect pest, feeding only on the foliage and may not always require control. This shows some of the typical feeding damage that you get from spring feeding caterpillars. Initially, you might see these small bullet-shaped holes on the leaf. Eventually, though, as they get bigger, you can get these kind of really large chomps out of the foliage. That can seem quite large, and that damage stays there as the leaf grows, and so that it can sometimes, the holes remain there throughout the season, even though the caterpillars aren't there. So it can seem worse than it actually is. Other types of damage, depending on the species, include tents, which are produced by tent caterpillars, or silken mat. Sometimes that becomes a bit more noticeable as the tree grows. And then if you have leaf rollers present, they will fold the leaves over. So you might see a folded leaf with feeding around it, potentially some excrement and some silk webbing. Spring feeding caterpillars generally become active early in the spring and are present through to the end of June, depending on the species. So you want to start monitoring for them beginning at bud break and continuing through to late June. The general protocol is to examine 10 terminals per tree times 10 trees, and you're going to be looking for presence of caterpillars, but you also want to be looking for the feeding damage that I described earlier, because often the caterpillars themselves aren't there. In terms of thresholds, we do not have any established thresholds for spring feeding caterpillars on hazelnuts, but for that complex on apples, they will tend to treat at about 10 to 15% of terminals being infested. Above that, that is their treatment threshold. However, that can be used as a guideline for hazelnuts, but may need to be raised or adjusted depending on the species and as you gain more experience with that insect. Certainly for gypsy moth, which I'll get into later, we may have a lower threshold at which we might want to treat. In Oregon, where they're dealing with the oblique banded leaf roller on hazelnuts, they use a threshold of 20 to 25% of terminals infested in that early season generation. Cultural controls for spring feeding caterpillars can include pruning out infested branches and larvae for things like tent caterpillars, where they are all concentrated together. For things like gypsy moth and others, if you can get out there very, very early in the season, you can sometimes scrape off the egg masses before they hatch out. That is practical for smaller trees, but not necessarily for large acreages or large trees. Natural enemy populations such as birds, stink bugs, parasites, and a number of diseases can also really help drive down populations of these spring-feeding caterpillars. They can be very active when the populations are very, very low, but when you have a boom population of spring feeders, they may not be sufficient to bring populations down, in which case treatment may be required. As I will be discussing with gypsy moth, many spring feeders have cyclical populations, and so they when the populations start to build, then the natural enemy populations kind of tend to follow and increase as the pest population increases, and the collective actions of those increasing natural enemies will eventually help crush populations after a few years. That's true for gypsy moth and tent caterpillars and some other species. So with regards to chemical controls, it's important to be aware that a healthy, mature hazelnut can withstand most defoliation from most species, with the potential exception of some of these species such as gypsy moth in a peak population year. However, if you have very young trees, they may require sprays if thresholds are, but try to avoid doing that until thresholds are reached to preserve your natural enemies. And for many of the products we have registered, that's best timed against the younger larvae. Just want to touch briefly on the gypsy moth. It is a spring feeding caterpillar, but it has been particularly destructive. So for the vast majority of the spring feeding species, they don't typically require control on hazelnuts, but gypsy moth has caused a considerable amount of defoliation in our younger hazelnut orchards since about 2018-2019. So we'll talk just briefly on why that is and what this species looks like and what would be some management techniques. The gypsy moth is actually an invasive caterpillar in North America. It's native to Europe. It was introduced to North America in the late 1800s and has since spread throughout the eastern United States, Ontario, Quebec, and parts of the Maritimes. And it has an extremely wide host range of over 300 plant species that it will feed on, deciduous plants, largely in forests. However, it will feed on some orchard crops, and unfortunately, hazelnut is a preferred host crop for this species, so it can do quite a bit of damage in hazelnuts in particular. It does have boom and bust population cycles, as I mentioned earlier. It will cycle between almost not noticeable levels of insects up to explosive populations that cause massive amounts of defoliation. Those populations, once they get that high, their predators and pathogens tend to catch up with them, and then they crash again. The problem for hazelnuts is that in the last couple of years, since 2019-2020, we have been in the midst of an unprecedented boom in Ontario. So the highest numbers of acreage infested in Ontario since gypsy moth first started appearing here since the 1960s. And unfortunately, this has coincided with a large amount of planting of hazelnut orchards. So you have huge populations of gypsy moths with a lot of young hazelnut trees that can't tolerate a lot of defoliation. This just illustrates the gypsy moth life cycle, and it's typical of many early season caterpillars. So starting here in May, what you have is the larvae hatching. They begin hatching usually late April, early May. That's 2021. They started hatching about the very beginning of May, and they hatch over a period of a few weeks. So although there is only one generation, they're kind of staggered. It's not uncommon to have mixes of sizes of larvae all together at once, just due to that delayed hatching period. The larvae will feed for about 6 to 8 weeks after hatching, and initially there's just a small amount of feeding, but as they get larger, they feed more and more, and they can take huge amounts of foliage off of young trees, especially when there are a lot of them. But they will pupate by late spring, so you start to see pupae in June. That is going to depend, though. It may spread into July depending on when the egg mass is hatched out. The pupae will be present from 10 to 14 days, after which they will become adults. And you will see the adults starting in late July early August. And in 2020 in southern Ontario, you really couldn't sit on your back deck without being inundated by the male gypsy moths that were flying around looking for females to mate with. So the significant thing here is that as of the pupal stage, the gypsy moth stop feeding, and they will not feed again until they hatch out the next year. So by late June, whatever defoliation has happened is going to happen. You will not have additional defoliation from the gypsy moth. But if the defoliation is really significant in the early season, that can have an impact on small trees. After the adults mate and lay eggs, and that only lasts for about 6 to 10 days, then in late summer, the adults will die off, and then for the vast majority of the remainder of the year, the egg masses are present on the trees, and there's no gypsy moth active in the landscape. So a few more details on that larval stage. The egg hatch occurs when the trilliums bloom. I am recording this in mid-May, so most gypsy moth have already hatched at this point. The young larvae will climb to the ends of branches. Now, if it is a host that they like to feed on, they'll just start eating. But if it is not a preferred host, they use these silk strands, and they balloon to new hosts. They're very light, so it can carry them up to 3/4 of a kilometer and to new hosts. And then they will start feeding on those hosts. So if you have hazelnuts near a wooded area, you can get gypsy moth ballooning in from overwintering sites in that wooded area. So initially they're very, very small, less than 7 millimeters, and they are black. So they can be difficult to see, but they do feed mainly during the day. And they cause these small holes in the leaf, just sort of these bullet holes like I showed you earlier. Sometimes the larvae will be on the upper surface of the leaf, sometimes they will be on the underside of the leaf. As gypsy moth larvae grow, they become gray with these very distinct rows of red and blue spots running up and down their back. There's really nothing else, no other caterpillar that you'll find in the orchard that has these rows. It's a series of blue followed by a series of red spots, and they are quite large. Now, the older larvae feed mainly at night, and they move down the tree. They'll hide in dark locations during the day, and then come up at night to feed. But as they grow, they will consume larger and larger portions of leaf tissue, starting with small patches, but eventually they can consume the entire leaf. As you can see from the hazelnut tree, the young hazelnut tree on the bottom right corner, there's almost no leaf material left, and that is a case where the feeding would have a significant impact on the hazelnut tree. And 80 to 90% of the defoliation is caused by the 2 oldest larval stages. Monitoring for gypsy moth on hazelnuts is similar to that for other spring feeding caterpillars. You want to start looking for them beginning around bud break and proceeding through to late spring. The caterpillars themselves can sometimes be hard to find because they tend to hide during the day, especially as they get older. So you're going to want to look for the feeding damage, those small holes earlier in the season, and then the big chomps later on. 10 terminals per tree by 10 trees is a good number of trees to check at a minimum. And you're going to want to do it more than once because of that extended period of caterpillars hatching and then blowing into non-hosts. There is no threshold for gypsy moth on hazelnuts. We had mentioned early the threshold for spring feeding caterpillars on apples of 10 to 15% infested terminals, but that might be too high for gypsy moth on young hazelnuts. Really, if there are even a few gypsy moth on a very small hazelnut tree, you can have very extensive defoliation that can really impact the growth of the tree for that season. There are a few cultural controls you can use for gypsy moth on hazelnuts in the winter. If you had a bad outbreak the previous year, you can look for the egg masses and scrape them off the trees before they hatch the following spring, although there will still be gypsy moth blowing in from other regions. If you have a small orchard, then you can try putting burlap bands around the base of the tree, especially as they get older. This will attract the larvae as they migrate down to the base of the tree to rest during the day. And then you can go in, lift off those burlap bands, and physically remove the gypsy moth. But again, if you have a really large acreage and a lot of trees, that's really not going to be practical. There are a lot of natural enemies that will attack gypsy moth, and as I mentioned, as they get as the population continues, the predators and parasites will continue to increase along with the gypsy moth populations. So in many years when you have a low gypsy moth population, they generally keep those gypsy moth under control. But in a peak year before they've caught up with the gypsy moth populations, it may not be enough to get them under control. However, after several years, they will build up. So if we have hopefully a lot of rain this season, that's not good for tree diseases, but it is good for promoting spread of the major pathogens that attack gypsy moth, and that may help crush the population so that next year we will not have as many gypsy moth. Now with chemical control, you may want to be considering this with young trees. However, it is important to be aware that there is nothing actually labeled for the control of gypsy moth on hazelnuts. However, we do have a number of leaf roller products that are registered for oblique banded leaf roller, and when you're applying for that pest at that timing, it may provide control of gypsy moth, and that's best timed against younger larvae, both for OBLR and for that residual effect against the gypsy moth. As I mentioned, the gypsy moth populations in Ontario have been high over the last several years, so we are expecting natural enemies to start to increase. So you may see quite a bit of activity in gypsy moth this season. I just want to mention that you may see a lot of dead caterpillars on your trees, and sometimes growers can get concerned that that means that fungus that's on the gypsy moth will spread to their tree. It will not. They are specific to the caterpillar, so it's actually a good thing that it's there. It's killing off the gypsy moth, but they will not be harmful to your hazelnut trees. The final early season insect I want to mention that you may find on your trees starting at bud break or before are scales, specifically Lecanium scale. Scales are sucking, sap-feeding insects, which are named for their shell-like waxy coating or scale, which they form to cover and hide their bodies. So there's a number of different types that we see on Ontario hazelnuts, but the most common one is the fruit Lecanium. And this one attacks a wide variety of fruit and other hardwood trees. But the conspicuous life stage is the mature female. I've circled it in the photo. This is its waxy covering. It's a hump-like brown protective covering that it forms on twigs and branches. It measures about 3 to 5 millimeters in diameter. And the empty shells often remain attached to the trees throughout the season, which can help you detect them. So the Lecanium scale overwinters as immature nymphs under these coverings. So you can see those in this lower figure right here. We've lifted up the scale covering, and you can see all these little eggs which hatch into nymphs. These mature into adults approximately April and May, and then the adult males will leave those coverings to seek out females, mate, and die, while the females will remain under the shell, and they'll be laying eggs which will fill the mother's shell while the mother shrinks away. By late May or early June, those eggs hatch to produce immature scale nymphs which have legs, and they're called crawlers. So you can see them in this lower right photo. They are they're very flat, and they can be sometimes difficult to see, but these crawlers will walk away from the scale and they'll find new feeding sites, usually the underside of leaves, where they settle and feed until early fall. And then around leaf drop, they'll move back to new shoots, settle down again, and then they'll form that hardened scale to protect themselves to overwinter. Lecanium scale only occasionally reaches really high populations in hazelnut orchards, and it's usually only in certain orchards. When you have a very severe infestation of scale, this can kill twigs and reduce growth and fruit size, and it can weaken the plants and make them more susceptible to other major diseases such as bacterial blight or eastern filbert blight. But also, when the scales feed, they excrete large quantities of a fluid that we call honeydew, and that can promote the growth of something called sooty mold fungus, which covers the leaves and can in turn stunt tree growth. You tend to see that most of this honeydew happens in late spring when the nymphs are feeding very heavily on young wood. And if you have very high populations, it's actually possible to walk underneath the tree and feel that honeydew dripping on you. It sort of feels like rain. You can monitor for overwintering nymphs on last year's growth starting in early spring. They are often quite noticeable, although in the previous photo I showed you a shot with a large accumulation of scales. That's quite easy to spot, but sometimes you can have just a few, which you might miss, but if you're not used to it. But there's not much like these smooth round bumps extending from the tree, which indicate scale. Another indication of scale would be the presence of a sticky substance that you can't otherwise identify as anything else. So if you're feeling something sticky on the leaves, you might want to look more closely throughout the tree for the presence of those overwintering scales. When you detect them, you can turn those scales over to look for female development, see if the eggs have hatched, and then by late May, you can check the leaf undersides for scales, which will be there. You often will see that when you're looking at leaf undersides for mites, and that would be starting around late May and continuing through the season. For the most part, natural enemies such as lady beetles and lacewings can help keep scale populations under control. They'll actually wait by these overwintering shells as the crawlers emerge, and they'll feed on them, and this often keeps them below economically damaging numbers in hazelnuts. But if pesticide use or any other factor disrupts the activity of these natural enemies, then sprays may be required to prevent the scale populations from getting to really, really high levels and weakening the trees. So we do have a number of products registered for scale, and if control is required, then you want to time them for late spring when most of the eggs have hatched. The sprays will not be effective when the scale is underneath that hard covering. You need to have the crawlers exposed on the plants for the products to be effective. So you want to wait till they have moved out from underneath the mother and a few crawlers have settled on the leaves, and that would be the appropriate timing for sprays for this scale. I included a slide showing you these photos of nuts with holes because there are a few other insect species, specifically the hazelnut weevil, filbert worm, and brown marmorated stink bug, that will attack nuts throughout the season and result either in empty nuts with holes or other sort of distorted nut symptoms at harvest time. But if you're not looking for them when the insects are active, then you're not going to know from the nut holes what has caused the problem. Fortunately, we have not encountered many of these species in Ontario to date, so they're not included in this presentation, but they can be very problematic in hazelnuts in other growing regions. So I have included another presentation in this series, which I would encourage you to watch, and that is the insects to watch out for in hazelnuts. It is likely that as hazelnut acreage increases in Ontario, we may start to see these pests. This brings us to the end of the presentation on early season insect pests of hazelnut. For further information, you can refer to these hazelnut related publications that are currently on or will soon be on the OMAFRA website at www.ontario.ca/crops. Well, thank you for listening. My contact information is included here should you wish to reach out with questions or comments. I also encourage you to subscribe to our specialty crops blog that has timely information on specialty crops grown in Ontario, including hazelnuts, and that can be found at onspecialtycrops.ca.